As I walked out one day, I met an old man down by the way. His head was bald and his beard was gray. His clothes were made of the cold red clay. His clothes were made of the cold red clay. I said, "Old man, what man are you? What country do you belong to?" "My name is Death. Have you heard of me? Kings and princes bow down to me. All kings and princes bow down to me." As I walked forth one day, I met an old man along the way. His head was bald and his beard was gray. His clothes were made of the cold red clay. His clothes were made of the cold red clay. Now this story happened not far from here, in 1888. And if you doubt that this story did happen, you can look it up for yourself in the Julian Sentinel, in the newspaper from Julian, 1888. They reported on the story of Edward and Charles. Edward and Charles, they were from Julian. It was a mining town. A lot of people lived up there. And they would go hunting out by Warner Springs. Warner Springs is kind of northwest of Julian. And they would go out there. All around Warner Springs, they knew there was good hunting out there. They knew there were animals. But on this day, in 1888, they couldn't find anything. And they were out there, and Charles, he was a little younger. He was a little more cautious. Clean shaven. Charles, he thought they should go back home to Julian. He said, "It's terribly poor hunting today. I think we better go on back." Edward, he looked at him and he said, "I'm not going back empty-handed." Edward, he had a big old bushy cowboy mustache, like Sam Elliott in the movie The Big Lebowski, that kind of mustache, So he'd always push his mustache out. They were walking through the hills. He said, "I ain't leaving without some game." They stopped at a watering hole. They kind of bent down to take some drinks from this natural spring there. Edward, he told Charles, he said, "We got to find something." We ain't found a rabbit, a squirrel, nothing. And he said, Look back over here. You see that canyon? I'll bet there's some animals back in there. Something nobody else is. I'll bet nobody's even gone in there." They both looked at that canyon. The walls, they could see that the further back you went into that canyon, the walls, they just came closer and closer to each other. So they looked at the canyon, and suddenly Charles, he got this look on his face. Charles, he looked at the canyon, and then he looked at the watering hole, and he looked at the canyon. He said, "Edward, do you realize where we are right now? The canyon, the watering hole? This is Dead Man's Hole." Charles, Edward, he went pale. Charles went pale. They had heard stories about Dead Man's Hole. These stories, they went back 30 years, over 30 years back. That place had been called Dead Man's Hole. And they talked to each other, remembering the stories that folks told in Julian about Dead Man's Hole. Now you see, the stagecoach would come through, and the stagecoach would always make a stop right where that natural spring was, because the driver, the passengers, the horses, they could all drink some water. And one day in the 1850s, that stagecoach, the Butterfield stage, was coming through. The driver, he got off, and he bent down by that water, and he kind of bent down to take a drink, and then he screamed, and he jumped back, because he saw right under the surface of the water, his dead body floating face up. Pale, decomposing face just under the surface of that water. Ever since then, they started to call it Dead Man's Hole in the town of Julian, and that wasn't the last body that they found there. Over the years, people would go, and they would often find people always near that hole, somewhere between that water hole and that deep, dark canyon. Now, these deaths, for a while, nobody paid them much mind. This is the Old West. This is Julian's a mining town, and people disappear. Sometimes they get in fights. They move to another town. But the more people found dead people by that watering hole, the more it just didn't make sense. They'd find people with terrible bruises, marks on their bodies, strangled to death, always between that watering hole and that canyon. They could find no clear motive of killing these people. Years later, a rich man from San Francisco, he was found dead by that watering hole. His family, they had enough means to come down all the way from San Francisco to investigate the death. They asked around town in Julian, and nobody knew of any conflict with the victim. Everybody loved him, he had friends. The strangest thing about it is that when they found him lying there, he still had a wad of bills, money in his pocket, and a fine gold watch in his pocket. Nobody had taken that. They just left him with the money and the gold watch. But they killed him all the same. So Edward and Charles, while they were remembering all of these stories about Dead Man's Hole, looking at the canyon, Edward, he said, "Charles, what if we go up in that canyon? Whatever's been killing them people, it's up there. Whatever's been doing this, they're up there in the canyon somewhere. We could bring justice to all those people." Charles, he said, I don't think that's a great idea, Edward. Edward said, "Don't you think those people deserve justice? We could go, this is our homeland. This is where we live. This is our home, our place to hunt. Whoever's doing that, he's got no right to be doing that." Well, he finally talked Charles into it, reluctantly, but they went walking up into that canyon. Sure enough, it was really hard to get in there. They're just boulders and fallen logs, and it's tough to get through, and they're finding it really hard to climb through there. And the further in they went, the steeper those canyon walls got, till eventually it was really hard to see. The sunlight didn't really come down in there. It got dark and foreboding. They're walking through, and after some time they heard something up ahead, something clambering through the brush, making a terrible racket in the brush. Now Edward, he climbed up on one of the canyon walls. He climbed up on those rocks to look and see if he could see what was making that terrible noise. He got up there and he looked and he saw, well, it looked like a bear running away from them, running through the canyon. This thing was making fast pace, running, jumping over logs, jumping over rocks. And it looked like a bear. It had long, brown, shaggy hair, and it was swinging its arms like this, not like a bear would. So Edward, he called Charles up to him. He said, we've got to stop that thing. We've got to spook it so it doesn't get away. So he took his shotgun, fired 3 shots up in the air, and that thing, it stopped. It stopped, and it turned in and looked at them, and both of them gasped as its face looked human. All covered in brown hair except for that human-like face. Well, they chased after it. Pretty soon that thing started climbing up the canyon walls, up toward this dark, shadowy, looked like a cave up on the top of the canyon walls. Edward, again, he pointed his shotgun. He fired, and he hit that thing. And it fell down from the canyon, fell down with a terrible thud and a nasty scream. And they walked up to it real quiet, real slow, making sure that thing is dead. They got up to it. Sure enough, it's not moving. It's lying there, all covered in that shaggy fur. Ugh, Edward said, the stink off of this thing. Charles looked at it and said, that face is terribly human, Edward. Sure enough. Except for these, Edward said. He took the barrel of his gun and he kind of poked at that thing's mouth. Had these long white fangs coming out of its mouth. Charles said, I've never seen feet that large on a man, a beast, or anything. Edward said, we better take this, we'll pack it on the mule, we'll take it back to town, back to Julian, we'll show everyone. But first, I want to take a look at that cave. Charles said, Edward, I don't think that's a great idea. Let's take a look up in there, see where that thing was living. So they climbed up that canyon wall, they got up to that cave. And they walked into that dark cave. It took a while for their eyes to adjust to the light. They walked in there. Terrible stink in this cave. Smell of death, blood, gore. They walked in. They looked. They saw back in the back corner of the cave, there was this pile of leaves and brush. That must have been that thing's bed. And they walked back there, and next to that bed, they saw a different pile. And this pile's a pile of bones. Some of them still had some meat on them, some blood on them. Some of them animal bones, but they recognized Some of them were human too. And they saw right in front of that there was a sheep carcass. That thing had stolen a sheep from one of the ranchers, half eaten, half gnawed on, lying there. And Charles said, Edward, you better take a look at this. Edward walked over, and right next to the carcass and the bones on a ledge in the wall of that cave, they saw 8 human skulls lined up on that ledge, sitting there like trophies, smiling back at him. Then they realized that thing had been killing animals, killing people down near that canyon, near the watering hole. And well, the people that they found, those folks, that something must have frightened the animal, the creature, off before it could eat those people, so it left them lying there. That's why it left them with money, with gold. It didn't care about those things. It just wanted to feed. And Charles said, Edward, what if this thing has children? What if this thing has a mate? They're going to be coming back. They're going to see what happened to their patriarch down there. Edward, I think we better go back home. And for the first time, Edward actually agreed with Charles. And he said, Charles, I think you're on to something. We better get on back to Julian before the sun sets here. They didn't have time to take that creature back or anything. They climbed down from there. They went back to Julian. They told the story, and the Julian Sentinel reported that story, and you can read it for yourself. Now, we don't know if any of those critters are still out there somewhere near Warner Springs. We don't know if any of them survive to this day. But one thing Edward and Charles understood, it's that humans, we're not the only ones who think of this as our home. There's something else out there, too, that also thinks of this as its home. And just like us, that thing, it needs to feed. It needs to hunt. This is its home, too. As I went walking one day, I met an old man down by the way. His head was bald and his beard was gray. His clothes were made of the cold.